been created, the plutonium weapon would also have to be tested.
The plutonium bomb's new configuration called for an outer shell of explosives that would direct symmetrical shockwaves inward, compressing a subcritical central mass of plutonium. The resulting increase in the density would shrink distances between nuclei, thus starting the explosive chain reaction.
Nobody had ever taken high explosives, wrapped them around something, and got a symmetrical explosion. And so they weren't even sure they could do that technically. It was a very, very tough engineering problem.
Lenses were created, explosive lenses that would focus the shock wave inward to compress the subcritical mass to critical. High explosives were mixed to form the cocoon the fissionable material would rest in. The molds for the lenses were the biggest problems. The molten explosive had to be cooled just right to prevent air bubbles, which would interfere with the detonation. The lenses required precision casting with machine finishing. Tolerances for the 100 or so pieces had to fit together within a few thousandths of an inch.
Inside the very center of the bomb was an initiator, surrounded by a sphere of plutonium. This sphere was encased within a set of symmetrically located, high-explosive lenses, creating an implosion which forced the plutonium into itself, attaining critical mass.
But what if the real test was unsuccessful? The fissionable material might be lost from the detonation of the high explosive surrounding it. The decision was made early on to contain any misfire inside a huge steel vessel. It was 25 feet long, 12 feet in diameter, 14 inches thick, and weighed 214 tons. It was called Jumbo. By the time it was delivered, though, production of the fissionable material had increased, and there was greater confidence in the success of the bomb. Use of Jumbo was cancelled. Instead, it was hung from a tower 800 yards from ground zero.
They cancelled the use of Jumbo because at this point they had decided to fake it, and use of Jumbo would make the bomb be perceived as undeliverable.
Before assembly began, a receipt was signed for the plutonium, value at least several $100 million. At the moment the receipt was signed, the test shifted to military control.
Took that plutonium and in turn gave a shiny bomb casing full of used pinball machine parts.
They didn't allow many people, but they did allow me, and I looked with, I closed, had one eye protected. I couldn't look with both eyes, and so I was looking with just one eye.
All the scientists were 20 miles away, but most feared a dud, especially since a blank test of the explosives surrounding the core had failed just days before. Sensors showed that they had not fired simultaneously and would not have compressed the core properly.
It was really unnerving when the blank shot failed. The normal anxiety that one might have had with a device on which you had worked but had never been tested fully was heightened by the failure of the blank shot.
General Groves was lying on the ground in the prone position, facing away from the blast. What he said was going through his mind was, what was he going to do when the timer got to zero and nothing happened?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Despite the uncertainty and the doubts, the implosion device worked first time. With all the technical difficulty they admit to in making such a device, would you not expect a good few failures before you got it right? Of course it worked first time, because they faked it. As with all subsequent nuclear tests, it was fake.
At 5:30 a.m., July 16, 1945, the world entered the atomic age. With an intense flash, a sudden wave of heat, followed by a tremendous shock wave. The ball of fire extended 40,000 feet. The bomb packed a punch equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, completely vaporizing the steel tower and heating the desert sand into glass for a radius of 800 yards.
Later in the morning, Fermi and physicist Herbert Anderson donned white surgical scrubs and rode in 2 lead-lined tanks to ground zero. Fermi's tank broke down after only a mile, and he had to walk back.
Is there any reason they didn't want Fermi to see the evidence firsthand?
With a yield 200 times greater than the 100-ton test, the fireball created a crater nearly 1/2 mile across and fused the desert sand into a green glass still containing traces of radioactivity 50 years later.
Radiated dust and debris from the blast, fallout, would fall onto neighboring communities. At a few locations, detectors showed rises in radioactivity, but they dropped quickly.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The explosions were mostly created using large towers of hundreds of tons of TNT. A short time before the Trinity test, they detonated such a tower of 108 tons of TNT. The Trinity test was probably a larger such tower, of 1,018 tons of TNT.
May 1945. The hot New Mexico desert seemed far from the ravages of war in Europe.
The trick relies on encouraging people to believe a big explosion is a massive one. With eyewitnesses, this is achieved through distance. From a distance, it is difficult to know how big an explosion is. Most will accept it as being as big as they are told it is. It was very big after all. The trick also relies on people's propensity to exaggerate when recalling experience. It would have been the biggest explosion any of them had ever seen, and so they are likely to tell anyone who asked that it was big, in fact very big. They are unlikely to play it down and say, well, it wasn't all that big actually. For many of them it would have been the most interesting thing that had ever happened in their lives, and so they would tend to big it up.
In order to accurately calibrate the instrumentation for the test, another test, one using only high explosives, was needed. A dress rehearsal of 100 tons of TNT was planned for. Hundreds of crates of high explosives were stacked on the platform of a 20-foot tower. Tubes of low-level nuclear material were scattered throughout the explosives to simulate the radioactive products of a nuclear blast. Everything was set to a scale to match the expected effects of the nuclear test shot. On May 7th, the high explosive was detonated. The orange fireball was seen 60 miles away.
How big is this explosion? How big you perceive it to be depends very much on how far you think it is away and what you have to compare it to. The myth of the blinding light that supposedly makes nuclear bombs distinct from conventional ones is achieved using floodlighting and possibly mirrors, and possibly through the burning of elements such as magnesium within the explosion itself. It is often illustrated to the public with shots of extreme shadowing, which can easily be created in a studio. Most witnesses will never actually see the supposed blinding light, as they were usually told to close and cover their eyes, and often to turn their backs. Often the illusion was reinforced with protective goggles and clothing. The footage is generally put together using footage of smaller explosions, without anything in shot to provide size comparison, mixed with footage of the sun, sunsets, and clouds filmed using time-lapse photography. There is little or no unedited footage provided to the public. Almost all of the footage has cuts, and often cuts away to shots of observers, or shots illustrating the supposed destructive force, and back again to the footage of the developing aftermath of the explosion, and then away again and back again. And so, the public rarely sees a so-called nuclear explosion complete in one continuous sequence. Mushroom clouds are not unique to so-called nuclear explosions. The illusion of nuclear weapons was also manufactured with the use of very large conventional bombs, fuel air bombs or thermobaric or vacuum bombs. Up close and from a distance they could easily be mistaken for mythical, much larger so-called nuclear bombs.
But it was one unique conventional bomb that was the climax of high explosives in Vietnam. Called Big Blue 82, it was a blockbuster that caused injuries for miles. At 15,000 pounds, a single bomb was the entire cargo for the journey into hostile airspace. Delivered from the hold of a C-130 cargo plane, the bomb was slowed by a parachute and drifted to its target. When it exploded, the crater was enormous and the destruction total.
You're about to witness the mother of all bombs. The massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, or MOAB, 10 tons of H6 explosive.
When they were testing it, people actually thought they were testing small-scale nuclear devices.
Plus the psychological effect of the nuclear-style mushroom cloud is undeniable.
Good job.
Russian military has announced the testing of a vacuum explosive device that unleashes a shockwave with the power of a nuclear weapon, according to Russian scientists. U.S. forces have used a thermobaric bomb, which works on similar principles, in their campaign against al-Qaeda and Taliban forces.
The first and most obvious question people ask when confronted with the idea that nuclear weapons may be a hoax is, what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
While the scientists at Trinity site waited for the test in the New Mexico desert, the primary components of the gun-type uranium weapon were being hoisted aboard the cruiser Indianapolis. The ship set sail for the Pacific island of Tiene in the Marianas. A few weeks later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off in the early morning hours. Just after 8 a.m., it dropped the weapon named Little Boy, which exploded approximately 1,000 feet over the Japanese city of Hiroshima.
Boom!
The uranium gun weapon, or Little Boy bomb, was a simple design, and scientists were confident it would work without testing.
Designers considered a test prior to combat use unnecessary and impossible, since there was only enough U-235 for one bomb.
And so Little Boy goes into combat as an untested weapon.
In the past 24 hours, 4 heavily loaded B-29s have crashed on takeoff. Parsons' greatest nightmare